Saturday morning class. So I'm going to talk to you about this huge figure, Dr. Ambedkar, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, and he really is a towering figure. One really can't overstate actually how much of an important figure he is in world history. It's actually I find it really weird that how little known he is in the UK. I just find it weird. I can't quite work out why in a certain way. Actually, I might come back to that because I think there are reasons. But he's the sort of figure in India. Like if you imagine meeting somebody who hasn't heard of Churchill, Winston Churchill, or if you were looking at the era of the first half of the 20th century in the UK, Winston Churchill would be like probably one of, if not the most important kind of figure, wouldn't he, in that kind of era? So he's that sort of level figure, or Nelson Mandela in South Africa. That would, he's that sort of figure. The reason why I'm talking about him here today is because he's got a particular connection with our Buddhist movement, with Charatna. So a particular personal connection with Sangharakshita, who founded our Buddhist movement. And then that connection has then become a ongoing connection with our brothers and sisters in India, as Kshanti Kara mentioned. So fellow order members, our order is quite big in India, at least as big as it is in the UK, if not bigger. I think it is actually quite a bit bigger, the order. And then as probably a lot of you will know, or at least sort of have a bit of an understanding of, is in this community we've got our order, and then we've got the wider community, so mitras and other people who come to Buddhist centres. And in India, that sort of wider community is even much, much bigger. So we've got Buddhist schools and hospitals and all sorts of social projects in India. So it's quite hard to sort of say quite hard to evoke actually just like the scale of the Charatna Buddhist community in India. So I'm going to say, I'm going to try and communicate three main kind of things about Dr. Ambedkar today. And I should say, just to sort of give credit, I've kind of stolen the structure of this talk from another talk from somebody called Dr. Tom Wilkinson, who actually is a mitra based at the London Buddhist Centre in Bethnal Green. So I've stolen his talk. I'm just going to give you it today, but I'll be kind of adding my own sort of examples and kind of experience in India with our movement in India. So firstly, the first point is that Ambedkar that I want to try and communicate is that Ambedkar is the single most, I would say, Tom Wilkinson, who's got a PhD in post-colonial India, would say he's the single most important figure in 20th century India, and he's the most iconized figure in India. I'll be sort of saying a bit why. There might be another figure that comes to mind when I say that, and I'll definitely be talking about that other person as well. So secondly, the symbol, the story, and the idea of Dr. Ambedkar has a capacity to inspire us all towards social justice, real radical social justice. And it shows us, this story shows us that Buddhism is as much about transformation of world as it is about transformation of self and mind. And then thirdly, that Dr. Ambedkar is an ideal example of a Manu. So a Manu is this kind of archetypal figure which lays the groundwork for Buddhism, for the Dhamma to flourish. So those are the three things I'll be saying to you today. So first and foremost, Dr. Ambedkar is an anti-caste activist. So very, very important to understand that, first and foremost, that is what Dr. Ambedkar really, really devoted his life to, is destroying the idea of caste. So one of his most seminal texts is called The Annihilation of Caste. So many of you might not know what caste is. We don't have caste in this society, but it's very much part of Indian society. It's a system of social stratification, where people are born into it's hereditary. They're born into a certain, you could almost say like kind of destiny, the way that it's talked about, where basically you have to do a certain type of job. You have to be in a certain position in society. So we're quite used to, particularly these days in the modern West, being able to move through where you kind of sit in society. I was born in a very working class, grew up in a council estate, and went to a state school. But I've got lots of friends who are much more kind of middle class, and I've ended up with a bit of a middle class accent, even though I grew up in an East London council estate. And then I went to university and things like that. So in this society you can move through, can't you, class. But in India, you're born into a specific caste, or in this system, I should say, you're born into a specific caste, and that is where you stay. So there are kind of four main castes. The Brahmins at the top are the kind of priestly caste, and then you have the warriors, the Kshatriyas, the traders, the laborers, and then you have this other group that sits outside of the caste system. So this group is considered not even a caste. Even it's a group that sits outside of the caste system, not even kind of good enough to be within it, and they were known as untouchables, because it was considered polluting to touch or even look at people who were so-called untouchables. Now they're often known as Dalits, so the Dalit community. And Dr. Ambedkar belonged to this group, the so-called untouchables. He was born as a Dalit. So these people couldn't marry they couldn't marry caste Hindus. They couldn't eat with caste Hindus, or mingle in any way with them. So you can see, hopefully you can immediately see, the caste system, well, it is a form of evil, actually. It's a form of awful degradation of human beings. It's now outlawed in India, but as racism in the West, the effects do carry on, and it's still many of my friends in India have experienced or do experience casteism in much more subtle ways than it was. You would have experienced it. Dr. Ambedkar would have experienced it growing up, but sometimes more subtle ways, sometimes not so subtle ways. But it is outlawed now. So in Dr. Ambedkar's day, so he was born in 1981, and in his day, in the early 1891, sorry. Dalits wouldn't have gone to school. Yeah. So yeah, they wouldn't have gone. They wouldn't have gone to school. In fact, they weren't even allowed to like drink the same water as caste Hindus. It was really, they weren't even allowed to live in the same village. But through a complete stroke of luck, Dr. Ambedkar managed to get an education. Actually, more than that, he ended up becoming the most educated man in India. So this is an incredible story. His father was in the army, in the British Indian Army, and basically through that he got access to some education. And because the British weren't sort of recognising, they didn't understand caste. They could never really sort of get their head around it. And he was quickly identified as gifted, very, very gifted. In fact, he passed matriculation at the age of 15, and he was sent to the University of Columbia, in America. He was sent to the University of Bombay, and then he went later to do his degree at the University of Columbia. He then wrote a PhD. He ended up writing his PhD at the University of Columbia in public administration and currencies in India. So he was an economist. And then he came over to London and did another PhD at LSE, his second PhD. So he lived here, just over 100 years ago, between 1920 and 1923, lived in North London. And then he was actually called to the bar, so he became a barrister. He then went back to India with 2 PhDs, pretty much definitely the most qualified man in India. And he was a Dalit. So this would be incredible today. Like by today's standards, this would be incredible. And this happened 100 years ago. So it's kind of, it's actually quite unfathomable, like, how this kind of actually happened. So yeah, he was a statesman. He became a statesman. He became a politician, and he really kind of went on a bit of a journey with that. So initially, when he went back to India, he tried to find work in the state of Baroda as a barrister, and he faced a huge amount of discrimination there. In fact, so he was working, and even the office peons, the sort of people who would just be kind of, going and getting you your files in the office, they wouldn't even hand him his files because they didn't want to come that close to him. They would come. So these are the sort of, and India is a very hierarchical society. These are the sort of like, just people who are kind of going around and getting your files for you, like the interns or whatever. They would come in and throw him the files that they had to get for him because they didn't want to come anywhere near him. People would, when they initially found out that he was from an untouchable community, they would come and throw rocks at his house. So he faced a huge amount of discrimination, even at this point. He's the most qualified man in India at this point, right? But he pushed through, and he was particularly concerned with campaigning for Dalits, for people from his community, to have equal rights. Initially, one of the big things that he was campaigning for was Dalits to have access to water, to the same water as others. So he led a very famous kind of protest where him and I think it was hundreds or maybe thousands of his followers went and drank the water from a village. Incredible kind of form of protest. They just went and drank some water, and this was completely scandalous. Like, it was, there was huge amounts of violence because of this. He supported a labour agitation in Mumbai, working with the Communist Party of India, and then he set up his own political party, which is now known as the All India Scheduled Caste Federation. So it's still going now, the sort of legacy of Dr. Ambedkar's politics. In fact, I think his grandfather, or at least last year, I don't know, because they had an election last year, but last year, his grandson is or was a sitting MP in the Indian government. And he negotiated with the British. He was at the table negotiating with the British for an independent India, sitting alongside the likes of Mahatma Gandhi. So I mentioned before that Dr. Ambedkar, I think, is the most iconized, most most iconized figure in 20th century Indian politics. And you might think, well, what about Gandhi? You could say that this period of Indian history was a kind of tension between Ambedkarite politics and Gandhian politics. Yeah, they were the two kind of giants of Indian politics at the time, and the sort of the independence movement, actually. But they really did not get on. Yeah, they really did not get on. They had some very fundamental disagreements. And actually, the nature of their disagreements was really about caste. So Ambedkar felt really strongly that caste, the whole caste system, would never allow Dalits, people from his community, to be free, to be respected, to have any form of dignity. Whereas for Gandhi, the caste system wasn't necessarily bad. Yeah. So Gandhi believed that the caste system, he was a Hindu, he believed in it. Yeah. He did think that untouchability was bad. So Gandhi did say, we shouldn't have untouchability. He thought that was wrong and that it should be banned. But Ambedkar felt that he didn't kind of go far enough in pushing against that. But really, Ambedkar, fundamentally rejected caste system, whereas Gandhi supported it. In fact, Ambedkar tried to pass a policy. At this point, he was working in government. He tried to pass a policy banning caste, the whole caste system. And Gandhi said to him, "Unless you reverse this policy, I will fast to the death." So basically blackmailed him into kind of, not being able to do that. So this is why, particularly, if you talk to people from this sort of community in India now about Gandhi, they're baffled as to why Gandhi is held up in the way that he is in the West, and they can see that, well, as far as I can tell, it's kind of coming from the fact that we're just not, most of us just aren't in contact with these communities in India. So we have a particular view of India from here. And there was a famous movie, wasn't there, with what's his name, who played Gandhi in the movie? Ben Kingsley. Yeah, there's a Ben Kingsley movie with Gandhi, whereas we don't have a Ben Kingsley movie with Ambedkar. So, yeah. So Dr. Ambedkar, well, so that was all happening. There was this negotiation for independent India. In 1947, India becomes independent. And Nehru, the India's first Prime Minister, invited Dr. Ambedkar to become the law minister. Yeah, so he became India's first law minister. Again, it's incredible for a Dalit for this to happen. He joined the committee for the drafting of the Constitution of Independent India, quickly became its chairperson, and now is largely held responsible for writing India's constitution, which is held up around the world as one of the most progressive national constitutions, even today. Remarkably progressive document, talking about not just caste, but also the rights for women and all sorts of kind of oppressed groups. But ultimately, he left politics because he felt that he couldn't reform Hinduism. So he was trying all of this time. He's trying to reform Hinduism. So he tried to pass what he called the Hindu Reform Bill, which would have given more rights to oppressed communities, including women. And in 1935, he said, this was quite a huge statement for him to make, particularly in the nature of, in India, your religion is a very, very strong part of your identity. I mean, for everyone it is. But particularly in India, how people relate to each other is so much on the basis of which religion you are. Whereas in multicultural in London, we don't sort of see that so much. Anyway, in 1935, he said, "I was born a Hindu, but I will not die a Hindu." So he announced his intention to convert away from Hinduism, to leave the Hindu fold. So this was huge news at the time in India. And he went off to reflect on, he said he'd been reflecting, but hadn't worked out yet whether or not he would become a Sikh, a Muslim, or a Christian. So those are the other three large religions in Buddhism in India. Buddhism didn't even come into the question initially, at least in the public sphere. It might have been somewhere in his mind, but Buddhism was a real mind. There were almost no Buddhists in India at that point. It had died out. It had basically died out around the 12th century. So it had its kind of time about a sort of. It had a sort of while to flourish after the Buddha lived in India, but then went further east. So by this point, it had basically died out from India. He was apparently kind of asked by the Sikhs, the Muslims, and the Christians. All of them wanted them to join him. Basically, they could see, because he had millions of followers by this point. There were millions of people from these so-called untouchable communities who were looking up to him as somebody who was going to liberate them and save them from the oppression they were facing. And they could see that, everybody could see that when Dr. Ambedkar converts, all of his followers are going to convert with him. So the Christians, the Sikhs, and the Muslims, they were all campaigning for him to come and join them. Apparently, the few Buddhists that were in India at the time barely paid any attention. But the Lisan of Hyderabad apparently offered him a small fortune to convert to Islam. But he went away and reflected. He wrote a lot, thought very deeply about which religion would liberate his people. And what he saw was that caste is mind created. That was his kind of quite strong kind of insight into the nature of what was going on here in Indian society. There was this mind created conception that was creating all of these issues. And then he saw that Buddhism saw that too, that Buddhism talks about the world being mind created. And so he thought, oh, okay, so there is a religion that is talking about, the fundamental issue here, that we've got something that is mind created, and what the mind can create, the mind can destroy. Is a very famous Dr. Ambedkar quote. That could very much just be a Buddha quote. Clearly he was reading about Buddhism at the time. And then he saw even further than that central to Buddhism is a critique of caste. One of the most fundamental teachings of Buddhism is that anyone can become enlightened. Yeah, so that is just, you can't have caste if you have that. So some years later, he after reflecting on this for some years, he, on the 14th of October in 1956, in Nagpur, right in the center of India, he converted to Buddhism, along with 460,000 of his followers who gathered. So this is kind of where the connection with one of the strong kind of bits of connection with Sangharakshita as well, because Sangharakshita is the founder of our tradition, an Englishman who lived as a monk for India, in India for 20 years, and was living in India at the time. So he was living in India around the 50s, the 40s and 50s, came back here in the early 60s. And he went to meet Dr. Ambedkar a few times. So we had a few meetings, and I think it was the second meeting that they had when Dr. Ambedkar told Sangharakshita about his intention to convert to Buddhism, and he said, "I'm going to convert to Buddhism." He'd been writing about Buddhism. That's why Sangharakshita had come and got in touch with him, Dr. Ambedkar asked Sangharakshita, how do I do this? Like, what, you're a monk, how do I do this? And Sangharakshita said, well, any monk can administer the refuges and precepts. It's a very traditional chant, probably a lot of you have done. And that's the traditional kind of form, basically, of how you would kind of, that's the ritual to convert to Buddhism. And Dr. Ambedkar immediately said, well, can you do it? Can you lead this for me? Actually, Dr. Ambedkar replied and said that, Sangharakshita replied and said, I could, but I think it would be better if you got the monk who ordained me, U Chandramani, to do it. And he said that was for a couple of reasons. One, because it was an Indian, and it would be much better if it was an Indian ordaining, giving him the refuges and precepts. And secondly, because he's the senior most monk in India, so it will, it will carry a lot of weight. So that's what happened in Nagpur. Chandramani, the monk who ordained Sangharakshita, administered the refuges and precepts to Dr. Ambedkar, and then Dr. Ambedkar then, in a very radical step, led the refuges and precepts for his followers, which wasn't really done. It was, you should be a monk to do that traditionally, but he was kind of making a step and saying, actually, lay people can ordain lay people. He was actually very critical of the monastic institutions, as was Sangharakshita as well. So yeah, he led this huge conversion, 460,000 people. They'd gathered there um, from all around, all dressed in white, symbolizing this purification, that they were entering into by converting to Buddhism, by leaving the Hindu fold, and kind of taking that on themselves. I've met a woman who's now obviously quite old, who was there at the time. I think she was 10 or 11 at the time, and yeah, amazing to see kind of like her sort of memories of this event. She was telling me how there was just kind of smoke of incense in the air, and I mean, this was all being translated. She couldn't speak to me in English, but I think what she was basically saying was there was kind of angels or gods or something in the air, and that was all I could kind of get from her, basically, on her experience. But it was certainly communicating something to me of the kind of preciousness to which she was holding this whole experience, because this was a liberation for their community. They were leaving this awful oppression, and yeah, there were then further mass conversions in the following days, and 3 years later, the number of Buddhists in India had gone from barely sort of like countable, probably in the hundreds or if not thousands, to over 3 million. Now there are over 10 million Buddhists in India, most of whom are followers of Dr. Ambedkar. Probably a lot of the others who aren't are Tibetans, so Tibetan refugees. But then what happened? 7 weeks later, 7 weeks after he led this conversion, Dr. Ambedkar died. He had been ill for some time, and actually he was trying to get this in before he died, because he felt that it was coming. He'd had really poor health and was really kind of pushing through that. He managed to complete a book called The Buddha and His Dhamma just before he died as well. But this incredible story of Sangharakshita then responding to this. So Sangharakshita felt that he should go to Nagpur. This was 7 weeks after Dr. Ambedkar had led this conversion. He was due to be in Nagpur a little bit later, a few months later, I think. But he decided, for some reason, he was in Mumbai or Delhi, I think, at the time, and he decided, I need to go to Nagpur now. I don't know why, but I really need to go now. So he got on a train, got there. He told the people he was staying with he was going to be there earlier than he thought. He was received by over 2,000 people chanting victory to Dr. Ambedkar, victory to Bhikkhu Sangharakshita when he arrived. Went to his hotel to rest, and he was there but a few hours when somebody came and knocked on his door and said, Baba Sahib, Dr. Ambedkar has died. And they were all in floods of tears. They had just completely distraught. Somehow Sangharakshita was there, and they all started saying to him, we need you to now speak to us. We need you to sort of say something. There are masses of crowds gathering. We need you as a Buddhist monk to say something. So he said, okay, well, get some loudspeakers and arrange something. And that evening, Um, he stood there. I think he was stood on the top of a rickshaw or something, to sort of be seen by the crowds. And one by one, some of Dr. Ambedkar's close friends and followers, colleagues, kind of got up to go and say something. And Sangharakshita was supposed to be the last of the speakers. But each one of them got up and actually couldn't speak because they were so upset. They were so destroyed, basically, by the fact that this man who was liberating them from, actually hundreds, if not, well, probably more like thousands of years of oppression in their communities, was gone. And they were all, they didn't know what they could now do. They didn't know what the next step was. They'd converted to Buddhism, but they didn't know what Buddhism really was. They'd just done it because he was doing it, and so he must be right. They had no idea what the next step was. So they were all too upset to even talk. And so then Sangharakshita gets up and he says, Dr. Ambedkar is not dead as long as you follow what he's given you, as long as you carry on his work, as long as you practice the Buddha Dhamma. He then devoted the next 7 years of his life going around to villages with these communities, talking to them about what Buddhism actually was, teaching them Buddhism before he came back to the UK. And some other monks carried on some of that work as well. But the scale of Sangharakshita's activities is just incredible in terms of how much he gave to that community. So he was then very keen that our order and our community carry on that work, and encouraged lots of his, quite a number of his close, some of the early order members, to go over to India and support that work. So that continues now. Now we've got this incredible community in India. So to sum up, I've tried to talk about these three things. Yeah. So this first thing, this first idea that Dr. Ambedkar is, well, he's just huge. It is impossible to overstate how much of a huge figure he is in terms of politics in India, even today. So Modi, for instance, the current Prime Minister, very, very different, complete opposite side of the political spectrum to Dr. Ambedkar. He will doff his cap to Dr. Ambedkar. He will garland statues of Dr. Ambedkar because he sees how important it is to millions of people there. The second idea is that Dr. Ambedkar shows us that he's just a very, very good lived example of Buddhism being about transformation of world and not just transformation of mind. So these communities that have converted, among all of the ex-former untouchables, the Buddhists are the people. The census results show that Buddhists are the ones who have managed to come up in terms of socio-economic status the most. And this is, I think, quite clearly because of what Buddhism teaches them about, kind of self-dignity and not kind of just giving up responsibility to a god, but actually, kind of taking responsibility for our own mental states and how we interact with the world. Kshantikara and I visited the home of a friend in India who was saying to us, it's kind of what you'd think of as basically a sort of middle class house in London, various floors, roof terrace and stuff. And he said, well, yeah, my father built this house, and before that, my grandfather moved into Nagpur around the time of the conversion, or maybe just after, and lived in a mud hut. So we replaced the mud hut with this house. In just a couple of generations, that's where they've come. Many of them have jobs in government and all sorts of things. And then third, that he is a perfect example of a modern Manu. Manu is an archetypal figure who lays the groundwork for the Dhamma to flourish, often talked about as a lawgiver, which is particularly appropriate for Dr. Ambedkar. So he laid the groundwork, and then others like Sangharashtra have then picked that up and helped a community kind of grow out of that. Yeah, so I really encourage you to kind of look more into the community in India. I'll be flying back over there on Wednesday, and actually I've been leading some pilgrimages in India in January and February. So if you're interested in that, do let me know. But other than that, I'll leave there.